So they're very clearly telling us don't spend money first on climate, and the evidence very clearly shows we shouldn't spend money first on climate. We should spend it on these smart things. However,
that is what we're hearing out of Davos with the WEF. These elites keep banging on about climate and throwing money at it. It doesn't ever really seem clear to me what the objectives are that they're spending their fortunes on.
The whole world gives about $200 billion in development aid. The US, I believe, gives about $60 billion, and then private philanthropy gives another $20 or $30 billion dollars. The point is, we give a lot of money.
Who is we exactly?
What it actually did was, despite locking down the whole world, it cut maybe our emissions to 6 or 7%. This year, we have to cut down 4 times as much. It'll be like having lockdowns that are 4 times as hard. Remember, 100 years ago, 2/3 of humanity starved. Today, less than 10% starve. And that means we can start being smart about our world.
Hello, it is my pleasure today to be joined by my friend Bjorn Lomborg. Bjorn Lomborg is founder of the think tank Copenhagen Consensus, and I have spoken to him previously about his last book, False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. He's authored several books, including Cool It, The Skeptical Environmentalist's Guide to Global Warming. But today we are going to be discussing his latest book, Best Things First, the 12 most efficient solutions to the world's poorest and our global SDG promises. We're going to get into what is an SDG, a sustainable development goal. In fact, when we last spoke to each other, Bjorn, we did talk a little bit about that. And as well as discussing this, I hope to ask you some other questions about what you're up to. You're in London for the ARC conference, and I want to ask you some climate things. I'll be tempted. You might not want to talk about it, but I'll see. But let's absolutely get into Best Things First. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you. It's great to have done it, and it's there's been a lot of great feedback. And I should also just mention, if you look at the cover, you can actually see the conclusion there. You just need to look at the cover and you've kind of read the book. No, that's not true. But it basically points out, here's the cost and here's the benefit. So the benefit is enormous for a tiny little cost. And that's, of course, why I'm saying these are the best things to do. If we did that, it would cost us a little. It would do amazing good for the world. Why don't we do that first?
Great. Well, let's talk about who the us is. And I think a little bit of history, and you go into the book. But so for listeners, what is a sustainable development goal?
Oh, it's a very good question. And I honestly don't think anyone really has a good answer. So the world has made tons of promises over hundreds of years. We promised to get rid of war and all these other things. A lot of things are really hard to do. So the UN has made enormous numbers of promises. But actually back in 2000, some of these promises really stuck. They were called the Millennium Development Goals. We basically promised to stop kids from dying, get them in school, stop moms from dying, get more clean water and sanitation, get all kids in school. That's pretty much it. And by 2015, when these promises ran out, we'd actually achieved quite a bit of it. Not all of it, and not all of it was because of what the UN had promised, but it had really pushed the target. So if you take, for instance, child mortality, back in 1990, when the targets start, about 12 million kids below 5 years of age died each and every year. That's a horrible statistic if you think about it. By 2015, it was only, and I put that in inverted quotes, right? It was only 6 million kids dying each and every year. Now it's less than 5 million. This is a fantastic opportunity. The cohorts are still as big. So we've literally reduced child mortality by half. How cool is that? Now, part of it was because of development, part of it was because people came out of poverty, but part of it was because we actually focused on some of the things that you can do something about very, very simply. An obvious thing is to make sure that people get vaccinated against I'm just forgetting what it's called.
The tropical disease.
Well, it's just measles. Thank you. Just because you get vaccinated against measles, that you get some very, very simple vaccines. They probably saved about 2 million lives each and every year. These are simple things that we do for all our kids in the rich world. Now we're also trying to do this for the poor part of the world. This worked really well, and so obviously the UN wanted to do this again. They wanted to do it for 2016 to 30. That's the period that we're in right now. And the problem was these original Millennium Development Goals were actually done by a few guys in a back room in the UN. It literally were all guys. There was like 6 guys in a back room that decided these are the targets that we're going to feel. That doesn't quite feel right? So this time the UN said, well, let's ask everyone. But if you ask everyone, not surprisingly, you end up with an enormous amount of answers. So we actually ended up with 169 targets, promises for pretty much anything you can imagine. So we wanted to get everybody out of poverty and out of hunger and into schools, which are great. But we also wanted to stop corruption and war and climate change, which we honestly don't quite know how to do, and tons of other things like getting organic apples and community gardens to everyone. All good things, but, not equally good, not equally effective. And so what we're now seeing this year, we're at halftime for the SDGs, for the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're nowhere near fixing them. Actually, most of them are going the wrong direction or not at all moving. Even the UN had to sort of say, yeah, we're not actually on track at all. And what we're then saying is, all right, look, that's because you tried to do everything at once. And of course you can't do that. There's not enough money. We can't do all things. Let's do the best things first. This is not rocket science. Let's just do the really smart stuff first. And that's what this book is about. It's not to say that we shouldn't do all the other stuff. I'd love the world where we did everything, but let's do the smart stuff first.
Forgive me if we just take one step backwards. Who's this we that what you mean when you're talking about? Is this we humanity? Is this we these organizations like the World Bank, the UN? Who is we exactly?
That's a good question, and there's no obvious answer. So, the simple answer is this is all nation states that have signed up to this. So the US, the UK, everybody else in the world. But the reality is, if you're actually going to deliver this, it is both about governments, it's about development aid, it's about philanthropy, it's about governments in the Global South, or the world's poorer nations. So we basically look at those, the World Bank called the low-income and low-middle-income countries. So the world's poor half of the world, so about 4.1 billion people who live there. Their governments, of course, should also be investing more. They invest pretty pitiful money because they don't have very much in education and many other things. But if they just invested a little more in some of these things, as we'll go through, I'm sure, they could do amazing amounts of good. So it's not just rich people who should do it. It's not just development aid. It's not just philanthropists like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and whoever, but it's also just these development governments. So it really is everyone. And I write in the book, and it may be a little bit of a cop-out, but I think it is true. It literally is the we is all people of goodwill. I'm not trying to convince people who want us to do war instead, but I am trying to convince everybody who wants to help make a better world.
It seems to me, so the way it is we is in that the US, for example, and you write this in your book, gave $21 billion to international development in 2021. And I think that the West, I guess, gives 37 billion. Is that correct? Have I got that right? So
I think it's so the whole world gives about $200 billion in development aid. The U.S., I believe, gives about $60 billion. And then private philanthropy gives another 20 or 30 billion dollars. But yeah, look, the point is we give a lot of money. Not all of it is well spent. Remember, the U.S., and this is true for other European countries, the U.S. Count part of the money that they give to Egypt and to Israel as development money. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on in there. My point is not to try to tell people, oh, you need to reprioritize. That's never going to happen. But in the money that you're giving to people simply because you want to make a better world, there you could start saying, well, how do you do that in the best possible way?
Okay. So, I mean, my kickback with it, maybe this is a wrong gut sort of instinct I have, is when I hear these big organizations like the UN and World Bank and even Bill Gates types, immediately it fits into my concept of the globalist technocrat elites doing things. And it's my belief, and I might be wrong on this, and you have given examples of where these have been successful, but is that it's better to do things bottom up and grassroots, and that's a quicker way to lifting countries out of poverty and out of these situations. And I guess I want to understand why actually you have this faith that we can do it from the top down.
So I'm totally agnostic for whether it's bottom up or top down. I am trying to talk to all the UN organizations and all the development organizations like USAID and DFID here in the UK. It's not called DFID anymore, but I'm calling it that because I can't actually remember what they're called anymore. And similar organizations in the rest of the world, because they actually spend about $200 billion each and every year, purportedly to try to make the world a better place. So, those are obvious people to talk to. But it also, the Gateses of the world that are spending, probably, we don't have a good sense of this, but certainly tens of billions of dollars on trying to do good in the world. But also all the people in, as I think you were saying, the bottom ups. So, everybody in Nigeria or in Kenya or in other, really poor places that are actually trying to say, why aren't we spending more money on this, that, or the other? Mm-hmm. And I published about 1,300 op-eds not in all, but in the majority of all of these countries, trying to tell them, here's a great way to do better education. Here's a great way to do better maternal and newborn health. And again, this is an inspiration. So I'm all for whatever you can sort of marshal, and the people who are listening to this podcast, if they're going to be spending some money for Christmas, saying, here's what I want to donate for, these are good ideas how to donate. We all spend money in different ways to try to make the world a better place, but all of us should at least pay a slight attention to what are the best ways to do it, not just what are nice sounding ways.
There you go. That's the sell. That's what I wanted to hear. Now, again, I want to get into this, but it's one last thing I want to understand before we do get into this is some of the ways it's being misspent at the moment. So it seems to me, some of the research I've done into it is that we're spending fortunes on climate policy or climate. What would you call them? Solutions or whatever, which are a waste of money, ineffective, and not actually helping. How big a problem? How much waste is there? Is that presumably that's one of the motivations? This is how badly this has been going.
Yes. So there's a lot of people who would like to say, we're wasting an enormous amount of money. My point with this book was exactly just to say, here are the very best things to do. It seems a little sort of destructive to just go in and say, oh, you're wasting money here or there. It's interesting, but it's actually hard to do. So we've done this with some economists. So we work together with hundreds of the world's top economists and several Nobel laureates and trying to make this happen. And if you want to go in and say how badly did you spend the money? First of all, you have to wait 5 years until you actually have the academic evidence, and then somebody else is in power and everybody says, well, yeah, but we're not doing that anymore. It also pisses off everyone when you go in and say, you're actually spending it really badly. So our goal was not to try to say you're spending it really badly here. The goal was to say, hey, how about you spend it really, really well over here? It's sort of a carrot rather than a rod.
I see.
But with that said, so for instance, one of the big conversations in the development discussion is, to what extent do we need to spend more money on climate? Mm-hmm. And very clearly, a lot of people feel like climate is going to affect the world's poorest the worst. And that's absolutely true. But remember, again, everything affects the world's poorest the most. But the question then is, do you help the world's poorest effectively by, for instance, getting them vaccines and making sure moms and kids don't die? Or do you do that through cutting carbon emissions? It very, very clearly turns out that you do it by vaccines and agricultural research and development and education, all these other very, very simple things that you can do right now that has huge impact on these countries. They'll also lift them out of poverty and therefore also make them better able to deal with everything,
well, that's
including climate.
In false alarm, you make that argument.
Yes, but a lot of people want to make aid into climate aid because it makes us feel, but remember, it's mostly rich people giving away this money. And so, it feels like, oh, that's one of the ways that we can live up to our climate promises. But in reality, you end up giving away, solar panels and methane collecting and of garbage dumps. These are all nice things. It's not like we wouldn't also like them, but they're not what primarily the world's poor are asking for. So again, if you actually want to do good, this is not the place you start. It's one of the many things you can do down the line, but it's just not the most effective things.
There seems to be a lot on health. And so you address tuberculosis, maternal and newborn health, and problems of malaria as well, various chronic diseases. And so maybe you can tell me a little bit about how we can address those things.
Yes. So what we did was we looked through all of the 169 markets.
We is Copenhagen.
That's Copenhagen Consensus. Yes. So we're a very small organization. We're trying to be effective, just like what we're asking everybody else to be. So we're like 10 people. We work with some of the world's top economists. So we basically try to get all of them to do all the hard work, and then we make sure it's all comparable. So we looked through all of the 169 targets in the UN. We had a bunch of different economists over this, both from a previous project and this project, trying to say, where can you actually get huge payback for every dollar or pound or shilling or rupee spent? And we identified 12 amazing places where you can spend money. So we believe these are the places where for every dollar spent, I'm just going to say dollars, but it works in all currencies. For every dollar spent, you will achieve at least $15 of social benefit. Actually, on average, that's also what the cover shows you, you'll achieve $52 worth of good. So spending it all, doing $52 of good is an incredible investment. Now, unfortunately, you can't actually get rich on this. I know some people in the podcast would say, "Oh, is there a business opportunity?" Because all of these things are basically things where you spend money, but other people don't die or other people become more productive. It's very hard to actually capitalize that. But it's a really, really good way to help the world. So as you point out, there are two main things. One is health, and other ways to save people's lives and make their lives much better. The other one is to make people's lives richer, that is, that they can get out of poverty and that they can build successful societies. So on the health side, very obviously, tuberculosis and malaria, big issues. I'm often astounded by the fact that tuberculosis was probably one of the biggest killers ever in the world over the last 200 years. It's killed about 1 billion people. It used to, in the 1800s, it killed about every fourth person in Europe and North America that died from tuberculosis. So, a lot of people that famous people from the 1800s died from tuberculosis. In Moulin Rouge, Satine, I'm giving away the ending here. Satine dies from tuberculosis, right? Lots and lots of people did that. And it was a terrible disease. But we figured it out in the early 20th century. We figured it out because it was about getting, antibiotics. So you didn't have to send people to sanatoria. You didn't have to see tons and tons of people die. We fixed that. But unfortunately, we haven't fixed it in the poor half of the world. Now, it's much better in the poor half of the world, but there's still about 1.4 million people that die from tuberculosis each and every year. Almost all of these could be avoided. So we propose spending about $6.5 billion a year, and that is both in finding more of the disease. A lot of people don't get tested, and a lot of people don't keep taking their medications because you actually have to take your medication for half a year. That's hard. Imagine what you're like if you have to take medication for 2 weeks. Once you get better, you can kind of stop doing it. But it's very simple to do. It's, there are some very, very simple ways that you can get better apps. You can get sort of programs where you give people a juice box when they've finished, a month of taking their pills and so on. And what you do is basically that could avoid most, not all, but most of this tuberculosis death. We could save 1 million people a year. From that alone.
Where in the world are they? Is it particular areas where these?
So this is to a very large extent in India and some places in Africa, also in Indonesia, a few other places. So there's some in Uzbekistan, and there's also quite a bit in Russia. And I'm not sure how we would go about doing that. Our goal is not to look at upper middle income countries. We're only looking at this place in the poor half of the world. But those places need help. They need assistance. They need better instrumentation. So one of the problems that come, for instance, in India is that you have a lot of private practices. So you have public and you have private. Most people will go to a private provider first because you have to wait for 24 hours or for a very long time in the public sphere. You go to this private provider. He or she may be a good doctor, may actually kind of know. There's a lot of stigma to having tuberculosis. So most people actually want to hear, I don't have tuberculosis. Chances are also it looks, the symptoms look like a lot of other things. So chances are you're being told, you know what, that's just a cold, here's some Vicks, you're fine. And people are actually really happy to hear that. So a lot of times you don't actually get tested. That's how it goes on. So in Bangladesh, for instance, they have the world's biggest NGO. It's called BRAC. They have old women, typically widows, who'll have like the responsibility for 15 other families. Then they'll go around and ask every week, so how are things? And one of the things they'll say is, did anyone cough a lot last week? And, if they've coughed a lot for 3 weeks, then maybe sort of guide them over to get tested. The reason why people don't want to get tested is this is very, very bad for your social abilities and for your job. So in Kenya, for instance, 1/4 of everyone who gets TB also get divorced because do I want to be together with someone who has TB? No, and they'll lose their jobs, all kinds of other things. So it's very costly and all these things. The point here is at very low cost, so about $6.5 billion, not nothing. But, in the big scheme of things, at couch change, we could save about 1 million people each and every year. And that is one of the best investments. We estimate for every dollar spent, you'll do $46 worth of good. It's just a fantastic investment. And again, getting this message out. So what we're doing right now in this podcast will help people say, ooh, I didn't know. I hear about all these things, and what you hear about is obviously COVID because it hit rich people, and you hear about Ebola because it's really, really flashy. But these are not the things that are actually terribly damaging. Yes, COVID was in 2020 and 2021, but no more. By far the biggest infectious disease killer is, again, tuberculosis. Something you never hear about, but you should.
So you mentioned that COVID's come up, and one of your chapters is on immunization. So since COVID, it existed before, there was a vaccine skeptical crowd, and I think that's a much bigger crowd. And given how badly not only was government policy around the world on throughout the pandemic, but also now we're seeing an increase in excess deaths, whether that's because of being locked down or because of vaccines, there's still ambiguity to some extent. But you are making the case for childhood immunization, and I think in this time of growing skepticism, can you remake that case for
Yes, I think, and for several reasons. So we're very careful to say this is childhood immunizations. These are things that we've always done for our rich kids, but we should also do it. So that's why we talked about measles first. Measles is incredibly infectious disease. And, it killed, 800,000 kids in the U.S. In the early part of last century. And basically kills no one anymore because we vaccinate. You need to have almost 100% vaccination for this not to re-break out. This is, of course, one of the things that we've had the discussion with the anti-vaxxers. Look, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a immunologist or anything else. I'm a political scientist. I simply try to talk to some of the smartest people on the planet, and that we know that childhood immunizations work. One of the other things is rotaviruses. So again, this has been thoroughly tested, and it basically avoids one of the biggest reasons why kids in the poor part of the world die, namely from diarrhea. So we've actually reduced death a lot from diarrhea because we now know that you just need to give lots and lots of fluid. But it's much better that you don't get it in the first place. And that's what you do with a rotavirus vaccine. We think it could probably save about 500,000 lives. So again, the point here is not to say, oh, we should do another COVID vaccine and we should just push it through in 3 or 6 months. I mean, I'm fully vaccinated. I don't worry all that much about it, but I recognize that there's a lot of people out there who worry about it. This is not it. These are the very simple, basic childhood immunizations that we've given for a very long time that we also give to our kids. We know they work. They're much, much better than the alternative because our kids don't die. Yeah. We should do that for poor kids as well.
So there's, I could say, 2 of the chapters, which one on more trade and one on more migration. And these fit more into government policy, it seems, and rather than in kind of these more specific chosen areas. And I wondered then if we could talk about that a little bit. So again, let's say starting with free trade, one of the obvious downsides, it seems to me, for free trade is that it hurts the working people in wealthier countries because business goes abroad. Now, obviously, things become cheaper for them, which is a positive. But the movement we've seen, I think, it was a big part of the 26 movement was movement away from this globalization thing, and also with high skilled migration. That's also there's a lot of skepticism now against migration, and then in London this last 2 weeks we've seen some of the downsides of mass migration from parts of the world who share drastically different culture, completely opposing culture. So you're making the case still for free trade and migration. Maybe you can make that case for me.
So it's important to say for the free trade bit, I feel very strongly that we have a good argument. The migration bit is much more a sort of an economist point of view, but there are other costs that we haven't encapsulated, as you just pointed out, and I hope I make that very clear in the chapter as well. But for free trade, it used to be, at least for 100 years, that everybody knew free trade simply makes everyone richer. It means that if you do what you do best and I do what I do best and we trade, both of us are better off. Mm-hmm. That was sort of the standard Adam Smith point, and we've known that for 100 years, and it literally has made the world a much better place. But one of the things economists forgot was that there's also downsides, as you just pointed out. If we get better T-shirts made in Bangladesh, that's great for Bangladesh, but it's actually really bad for the people who sewed T-shirts in England or in Denmark or wherever they were. And that's a real cost. And of course, that's what we've rediscovered in this, in the last 2 decades, where a lot of the opinion has sort of switched away from, oh yes, we should have more free trade. And a lot of people have become almost protectionist. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I thought it would be useful for us to actually try to make the estimate much better. What is the cost and the benefit of free trade? And so I believe we've done the first, with some of the best trade economists in the world, the first real estimate of not only what are the benefits, which every economist likes to point out, and which was really just the basis of what Adam Smith was doing, but also what's the cost. And what we try to find out is, as you point out, that when you open up to more trade, it means everybody gets cheaper goods, but some people are going to lose their jobs, or they're going to see their employment go down, or they're going to see their wages go down. We try to estimate those with best estimate. This is hard. This is difficult. There's no good way to believe that this is true. It's an order of magnitude estimate that we're getting. But I believe, again, this is the first academic evidence. What it shows us, for rich countries, it is still a great idea to do free trade, but not as great as I think a lot of other people have been arguing, and I have been arguing in the past. What we find is that for every dollar that it has in cost, typically for working class people, their benefit's worth about $8. This means, obviously, that if we do this well, we can still make sure that we compensate these people who are hurt, get them re-education, maybe even just, give them the money so that they stay unhurt, and there's still $7 left over for all of society.
Yeah,
to
but
do
that's
well.
no small thing. Like,
That
if
is
you take
no
just
small
the
thing.
economics,
I'm
that's a complete life change.
Yes, I am not saying this is a small thing. So it is simply, we have identified that there are real costs, and we emphasize that, but also it is overall a good thing, even for rich countries. But, and this is the important part, for the poor half of the world, for low and lower middle income countries, the benefits vastly outweigh the costs. And basically because there's not all that many things that you're going to lose your job on. But when you open up trade, there's a lot of things that you can get rich on, and that will actually help grow your economy. So we find for every dollar spent, for every dollar that there is a cost, you have $95 of benefits. This is an incredible argument for at least poor countries should be arguing a lot more for free trade. That's the basic point. And I think this is useful to know that we have an order of magnitude. Again, all of the things that I put forward, so we have 12 great ideas. I'm not saying you should do all 12. I'm simply trying to say, here are 12 great ideas. This is why. And honestly, I'm fine if you just think 3 of them are great. Then you spend money on those 3. But free trade and migration is obviously more political. But I think they're still also relevant to know, because these are 2 things that we often talk about. And certainly for free trade, one of the things that have really pushed a lot of the global development over the last couple of 100 years, but we've now almost turned our backs on. And that's probably important to know. Well, actually, you could make people, especially in the poor part of the world, but really everywhere, much better off. We need to figure out that thing, which you just said was not a small thing, namely, how do we make sure that we leave the people who are hurt in a better place? And I think we have been blind as a profession, as economists, but also politically, we've probably just gone too far on this side. But in some ways, you could also argue now the world has moved way to the other side, and we've said, oh, there are people who are hurt, sort of the Rust Belt in the U.S. There are people who are hurt. Oh, so we should just stop. And so in some sense, we're throwing out the $95 of benefits in order to make sure we don't lose the one. That's also a very, very bad deal. So let's get back to thinking more straight about this and be honest about, yes, there are costs, but certainly for the world's poorest, this is still a phenomenal investment.
Well, migration is more contentious, I would say, even than trade. So not just for countries like this. So in wealth countries like Britain this year, or last year, had 600,000 net migrants. And just for context, before Brexit, which it was at 330,000 annual net migrants, and as well as sovereignty to control borders was the most popular reason people voted for Brexit. So it's an important one issue, and you're arguing for high-skilled migration, not just open borders, but high-skilled migration. Well, for the countries losing that's a brain drain. Do they actually end up going back? And it's usually masculine men who are leaving, if I'm not mistaken. And in the countries, let's say like Britain, that's coming through mainly, I think, through students, so people coming to study and then staying, and that's where you have the sort of open to any country's problem. And again, so just for context, of the 600,000, I think 120,000 were Hong Kongers, and there were between 100 and 150,000 Ukrainians. So we were very specific about where they were coming from. With students, it's less so the case. So along with that comes the baggage of completely different cultures, and they stay. And we're seeing some of the downsides of multiculturalism at the moment. So I wondered if you could make the case then specifically for high-skilled migration. Why are you still hanging on to that? despite the last sort of 7 years where we're facing up to the problems of migration.
Yes. So it's important to say, we tried to look at, all economists would argue that there's a significant misplaced of ability in the world. So fundamentally, people are much more productive in rich countries than they are in poor countries, and so some migration would be good. Some economists would argue that there are $1 trillion bills lying around, and that we should essentially open up for the whole world. I think that's probably not only wrong, but it's also missing out on the very general picture of this would be enormously harmful for a lot of the poor half of the rich world. So basically, people who are working menial jobs or lower income jobs, who would see an enormous amount of competition, and they would see their wages dramatically drop. This is not what we're talking about. And also, as you point out, we get a lot of people in there with potentially very different cultural interests. What we're talking about is very highly skilled migration. So this would be doctors, STEM workers, engineers, that kind of thing. The reason is that they are much more productive. So it's typically fairly standardized educations, and they would be enormously much more productive in rich countries than they would be in their home countries. And that's where most of the benefit stems from.
For the rich country?
Yes, they will make the rich country more effective, but they will certainly also make these people who formerly were in poor countries now rich. I would argue that this must surely be better than having them being poor. That's the main point of this, right? But as you also point, so what we're suggesting is a 10% increase of what you already have. But the point here is that would not mean these 600,000 people coming in. It would mean, and I don't have those numbers right there, but it would probably mean, 5 or 10,000 people, and these would all be highly skilled people. I think a large part of the reason why people object to a lot of immigration is that a lot of them have very little skills, and that, of course, is a much bigger problem for most modern economies, that you get people in who basically maybe don't even know how to read and write, and certainly can't really participate in an information economy. But the point here is, if you got those people in, they would become much more productive. They'd make rich countries more productive. But as you point out, it would also be a brain drain, at least in the short term. You would take away doctors from poor countries. But we also know that this leads to a lot of remittances, which actually lead both to that more people in the sending countries would want to become, doctors and engineers, because they now see a way to become really rich by going to the US or elsewhere. And it also means, because of their remittances, that there will be more education in these countries. So we actually estimate, even for those poor countries, it will be a better deal overall. So they'll lose some brain, but they will also gain a lot of extra brain by more education from both the remittances and from the added incentives of becoming one of those guys who can then later on go to these countries. So overall, we find that this is a good investment. We find that it'll deliver, I think it's $21 back on the dollar. So it's a good idea, but again, it's not. It's not, by no means the best thing that I'm describing in the book, but I think it is an important thing to know. It actually has net benefits. It can help lift out some of the people who are in poor countries now out of poverty and make them more productive. It is a good idea, but if you don't like it, that's fine. I'm not going to defend this with my, with my heart blood. I feel sort of, we know that this is one of the economic arguments, but it's not the one that I feel strongest about. I would put that way. When you talk to a lot of people in the poor world, yes, they want to save their kids and they want to make sure that people don't die, but they also really want to get out of poverty. And one of the most important things, and one of the most amazing ways that we find, that's really in education. So a lot of people will say, if you talk to people, education is key. Oh, yes, absolutely. But again, we're the guys who actually focus on where can you do a lot of good at very low cost so that you can do incredible amounts of good for every dollar spent. And that is in primary education. One of the things I think we don't really recognize is that a lot of kids are now in school. They're ostensibly, receiving instruction, But a lot of these kids will have virtually no learning because it's terrible schools. They're not very well educated. The teachers who are teaching them, and it's rote learning. It's not very inspiring. And then eventually they'll just leave. So if you actually look at the statistics of the almost 500 million kids who go in primary school right now in the poor half of the world, we estimate almost 80% of them will not really learn to either read or write. They will, technically learn to read or write. So one of the great examples of this is UNICEF gives a lot of questionnaires out. One of them is that you ask the kid to read the following sentence. So they have to read it. If you say it, they'll get it right. But if you have to read it, it'll say, Vijay has a red hat, a blue shirt, and yellow shoes. What color is the hat? Now, it's red. It's not a very hard question, but you need to actually not only be able to read the whole two sentences, but string them together into one meaning. 80% of 10-year-old kids cannot get this answer right. That's terrible. And what it tells you is they have learned to read. They can read Vijay has a red, but it doesn't string together into a meaning and something that they can actually manipulate and get useful meaning out of. And that, of course, means that you give up on lots of the ability of education. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can spend a lot of money on education and do almost no good. So we have some great examples from Indonesia who decided to double their spending on education, which of course comes from a really, really great place. They actually put it in their constitution. They doubled the spending on education mostly by hiring a lot more teachers and doubling the pay of each teacher. Because of the way it was done in different provinces at different times, you could actually go in and make a pseudo-randomized controlled trial study and see how well did it work on getting the kids to learn more. And the very famous paper was called Double for Nothing. And it basically showed that there was no impact on student learning. Now, the teachers were much happier when you pay them twice as much. They'll be much happier, and that's great, of course. But presumably not the main outcome of educational system. What you want is to get these kids to learn more. The answer is not predominantly to ask to pay teachers more or to have much smaller classes, although a lot of people will say, oh, that's great. It's probably a slightly better thing, but it's also very, very expensive. The real way to do this is to make sure that you actually teach each kid at his or her own level. The real problem is if you take any class in the poor half of the world, 50 kids may be in the classroom, one teacher, they're all over the spectrum. Some of these kids are far ahead and know everything what's going on. Some of them have no clue. What's a teacher going to do? You're sort of trying to aim somewhere in the middle, and you're losing the kids who are really bright, and you're losing the kids who have no idea what's going on. What you need is to have an ability to teach each one of these kids at their own level. Of course, one teacher can't do that, but putting them in front of a tablet with educational software actually can. So one of the things that is very, very well tested is to put these kids in front of a tablet 1 hour a day. It's not their tablet, it's the school's tablet. So they're going to be sharing with lots of other kids during the day. They just have 1 hour. So the rest of the day is going to be boring old stuff where they learn almost nothing. But 1 hour a day, they'll be in front of this tablet. It'll very quickly figure out, oh, you're at that level, and start teaching you at that exact level. What happens is, after 1 year of doing this, it'll cost about $31 per kid per year. And of course, we're included that some of these computers are going to get stolen. Some of them are not going to be used right. All these things. So all of the corruption is involved in there, is included in the calculations. But even then, $31 a year. But the benefit by the end of the year is that this kid will have learned 3 times as much as he or she normally would have. It's like going 3 years to school.
So, sorry.
This means that they'll become much more productive when they're adults. And this means that for every dollar spent, you will achieve about $65 of social benefits. It's just a fantastic way to make poor countries richer reasonably fast.
You've already made the point that some of those would get stolen, but I can't help but, as you're talking there, just imagine some of the poorest slums I've been to in, let's say, Nairobi or Addis Ababa, and think how out of place like an iPad would be in that scenario. How is it not going to get stolen? Like, they're so desperate, and this really is the bottom. The poorest people in the world, they're going to sell it straight away.
So in these studies, they've been trialed in far more than 100,000 kids. Part of the cost is that you also need to buy a place where you can lock them in at night. You have to have, many of these places don't have electricity, so you have to have solar panels. And as you point out, some of them are going to get stolen. All of this is included. So remember, pretty much all of the things that I'm telling you about is, when you talk about you need more diagnosis of tuberculosis, some of this is going to get stolen by doctors who are not good, and so on. We're including that people are being have bad motives sometimes, and that a lot. Honestly, I think more of it is actually going to go bad because of incompetence. The teacher just doesn't know how to start up the tablet, and so for half a year it doesn't work. And there's lots of different ways that it doesn't work. But the point is, even with all of that, it is a phenomenal investment. And it's partly because schools are so bad that you can not very easily, but you can reasonably easily make them a lot better with this 1 hour a day. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why it's only 1 hour a day. It's partly because that's the only thing you've tested, but it's also because, and reasonably so, teachers are worried that computers will take over the job. 1 hour a day is much easier to get teachers on board with than, say, 5 hours a day or something. So again, this is just simply what we have proven works, even though, yes, some of this is going to get stolen, some of it is going to be misappropriated and so on. The point here is it is such a fantastic investment that it really, really does work. And this is also true. So we have two other things that we're proposing. For instance, in India, instead of actually getting kids a tablet, you just simply test them once a year, and then you actually put them in their grade, right? So imagine you're a 12-year-old, but you're really at first grade level. So you go in 1 hour a day in the first grade. Now, this will have some social problems because you're going to be really the odd guy out and all that stuff. But, they do it with Pratham in India. It's much cheaper than having the tablet, and so you don't have the stealing issue, but it's also less effective, and you need more teachers and so on. But we estimate the benefit is still going to be about $50. If you do it for the third thing is to get the teachers to be more effective. So a lot of teachers have no clue on how to actually teach effectively. The idea of saying, hey, kids, I'm going to tell you about this, then tell it, and then sum it up and say, a lot of teachers just don't do that. If you give them semi-structured teacher plans, so every week you get them text messages and let them know, this week we're going to talk about fractions, and actually tell them what they should go through. It makes their teaching better. It's not going to be phenomenal or anything, but it makes their teaching better. And because it's very, very cheap, you can, for about $8, so cheaper than the tablet, you can actually make the teachers teach the kids better. That's another one of those things that we're arguing you should be doing, and actually delivers more than $100 back in the dollar. The point is not to say that you have to trade off or think about which one. It's simply to say to politicians, what would you like? How would you like to make your school more effective? And this is one of the ways that you can make societies become much richer.
Just politicians, or are there any charities doing this already? Or
so for instance, we worked with Malawi, one of the poorest countries in the world. And one of the reasons why they're now actually doing precisely this, they're actually getting tablets out to all of their primary school students, is because of the studies that we did. And part of the reason why development agencies, so both USAID, but also some private organizations, are giving money to this, and it's not a huge amount of money, but it's not insubstantial either, is because our evidence and many, many other people's evidence show this is an incredibly effective way to do.
Can I ask about your trip to Marrakesh? You were speaking with AJ Banga. Were you debating AJ Banga, leader of the World Bank, or is he not leader of the World Bank?
He's president, of the World Bank. So I was invited to the G20 finance ministers meeting, and it's officially a debate, but everybody apparently had already written out their positions, so I don't think it was all that much of a debate right there and then. But obviously, I think it was incredibly helpful for a lot of people to hear that argument. The main point I've also written an op-ed in Wall Street Journal about it is really the conversation saying, look, there's a lot of discussion about what should the world do in general, and a lot of people would argue we should do a lot of climate. This is very clearly in the world. And look, if you're a rich country and you're going to say, say you're England or the UK, we're a rich country and we want to cut our carbon emissions. That's fine. If you're saying it because you think that this is going to be phenomenally great for Africa, I think you're probably kidding yourself. But it's fine. You're a rich country. You can decide what you want to do. But we're also spending a lot of money on development, where the objective very clearly is to say we want to help the poor half of the world. And a lot of people are now saying, oh, but we should spend a lot of that development money on climate. And that was the argument that I had, basically saying, well, no, probably you shouldn't. Mm-hmm. If you want to do good in the poor half of the world, it is very clear that you can do a lot more good if you focus on the things that really hurt them, like what we've talked about with better education, tuberculosis, malaria, all these other things, rather than, for instance, not driving your car to work. That will incredibly indirectly help them a tiny bit in 100 years. Whereas, actually fixing education will help their kids right now, or, doing maternal and newborn health will help mom not die today. Yeah. It's just simply much, much more effective. And we know this for a fact. We also know, if you ask, leaders, opinion makers, or just ordinary people in the poor half of the world, what would you like? They universally say climate comes pretty far down the list, as it, by the way, it does in the rich countries, because they have much more important issues like, fixing health and fixing education, fixing all these other very basic things that they would like first. So they're very clearly telling us, don't spend money first on climate. And the evidence very clearly shows we shouldn't spend money first on climate. We should spend it on these smart things. However, most of the people who are discussing development want there to be a lot of money spent on climate because they're worried about climate, because they're often from rich places, or even if they're from poor places, they're often rich people in poor places where they worry a lot more about, 100 years rather than their own safety and their kids' safety right now. I get that, but it seems still to be pretty unreasonable.
It seems to me that that's a very widely held dogmatic opinion amongst elites across the world. That is what we're hearing out of Davos with the WEF. That is what we're hearing every year, or the COP conference. There's obviously the Paris Agreement. These elites keep banging on about climate and throwing money at it. It doesn't ever really seem clear to me what the objectives are that they're spending their fortunes on. So it seems to me you might have had at this World Bank an insight into how deeply held this view of the world is. And I'll give another example. And sorry, forgive me, we don't want to talk too much about climate, but I was on a recent radio panel of LBC talking about whatever it came up, and net zero came up, and everyone, there was a Tory, there was a Scottish National Party, and there was, I think, Labour or Lib Dem was the other person. And all of them agreed net zero to the point they zoomed off from this conversation about net zero, and no one's questioned it. So you're in conversation with these people at the World Bank. How deep is this dogma held, and how do we get them to orient to, as you say, people in both rich countries and poor countries? It's way down the list. How do we make those people, these people that you're directing it, start to actually look at what people want?
You're asking me, how do you make the world smarter? And I think the short answer is I don't have the complete answer to that. It's obviously a very hard deal, and probably we need a couple hundred years of
no, it's not out of the world
discussing. But I'm trying to make the good argument, so it becomes slightly harder to make the dumb argument. And I think that's what I put out there. I think a lot of the finance ministers were a little sort of, because everybody just, goes to these occasions and they all say, oh yes, net zero. Oh yes, we need to do everything. But of course, nobody actually does. We spend a lot of money on climate, mind you, but we don't actually act as if any country really believes in net zero, because if you wanted to go net zero, you'd have to do a lot more, and it'd be a lot more expensive. And of course, you'd get thrown out of government pretty quickly. So the reality is everybody says this, and we spend a lot of money on it.
Do you think they get thrown out of government?
Oh, God, yes.
By their own parties?
No, by
the people.
By the people. So look.
But I thought you said that the climate stuff wasn't popular. Most people.
Well, climate is incredibly popular when you talk about it, because it sounds like, do you want to spoil the planet or not? I mean, how can you say anything but or not?
Yeah.
But when you say, would you like to spend, say, 14% of your income on avoiding a 2% problem? Most people would be, what? What are you trying to sell me? And that's really what the question here is. Obviously, this is a much, much longer conversation, but fundamentally, when you start making it incredibly expensive, as you saw with the, I believe it was the heaters in the UK,
the boilers.
When you start saying, "Oh, you know what? You're going to have to pay £35,000 for this new environmentally sound thing," and people go, "I don't have. Are you crazy?
Exactly.
I'm not going to vote for you." And then, of course, they relent on this because they realize this is going to lead to political ruin if we actually push it.
Which is what's happening here in the UK, by the way.
Oh, and it's happening across the world. If you look at what the UN says about, do you remember 2020 when we had all those lockdowns from COVID? Yes, I think there seems to be a slight remembrance of that. What it actually did was, despite locking down the whole world, you still had to eat, you still had to do a lot of things. It cut maybe our emissions to 6 or 7%. So cutting the world so deeply and dramatically cut 6 or 7%. Now, if you were going to live up to what the world actually has promised, and the UN said this in a fairly funny sort of way. I think they didn't actually think it through. They said, "Oh, so we almost did what we were supposed to do in 2020. Now, in 2021, in order to get to our promises by net zero and by 2050, we have to cut down twice as much in 2021, and 3 times as much in 2022." We have to, this year we have to cut down 4 times as much. It'll be like having lockdowns that are 4 times as hard. Well, nobody would actually support that, right? And I'm not saying you can obviously cut smarter and more effectively than locking down civilizations. But the point is, this is very quickly going to be incredibly hard. And that's, of course, why most people say, oh, yes, as long as it's somebody else far in the future who will have to pay. But if it's actually me, oh, no. And I think that's what people in general know. But in specific, when it's about poorer countries, which contribute fairly little to the problem and who are actually going to be more confronted with climate impacts. They're going to be more negatively impacted by climate impacts, but also more negatively impacted by, disease impacts or by bad education and all these other things. There is an argument to be made to say, well, we should care more about climate. But yes, we should also care more about health and education and all these other things. And it turns out it's just a much, much more effective thing. That was a point I made in Marrakesh. And I think a lot of people were sort of, that does make a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people know, but they also know what's expected and what you normally say. And so I think it was useful to point that out. I don't think this is going to change the whole world or anything, but it is going to make it a little easier to say, if we're going to spend the next billion, should we spend it on cutting carbon emissions, which will do very little, but only far into the future? Or should we spend it on, I don't know, education and make sure that kids actually get much smarter now?
Can I ask you about ARC? Because you're here in London for the ARC Forum, and which we'll be attending together. And maybe you can tell listeners why you're excited and why you think, what it is to you and why you think we need it.
Yes. So ARC, I think, is a lot of things to a lot of different people. The thing that really sold me on it was the opportunity to have a different conversation from the standard argument that you hear almost all the time. We're kind of doomed. Things are terrible. We need to turn around, often in incredibly ineffective ways. And we need to do this across the world, very obviously with the net zero promise. And I think the opportunity for ARC is to simply, if you will, get the different but incredibly crucial argument out. No. Actually, if you look at the great scheme of things, the world has become much, much better over the past couple of 100 years. Just, basically, we used to live in 1900. We lived, 32 years on average on the planet. Mm-hmm. Now we live 73. We've more than doubled our lifetime on the planet. We're better educated. We have much less poverty. We've gone over the last 200 years from like 90% poverty to less than 10% extreme poverty. We also have a situation where we actually have much less pollution. Although you would think that there's a lot more pollution. Air pollution by far is the biggest polluter. There's a lot less indoor air pollution, and indoor air pollution vastly dominated because we're fixing much of indoor air pollution, which is basically burning terrible fuels. We did this in poor countries 100 years ago, basically having a live fire inside your kitchen. Yeah. Terrible idea in so many different ways.
We talked about this on our last episode.
And so we fixed much of that. There's still much to be done for outdoor air pollution. I'm not saying it's a great world. I'm simply saying it's a much better world. Remember, 100 years ago, 2/3 of humanity starved. Today, less than 10% starve. Again, that's still 10% too many, but it's a much better world. And if you look out into the future, a lot of people sort of think, oh, but climate is going to, turn all of that around. We're all going to, go back to sort of medieval times and it's going to be horrible and terrible. No, that's not what climate change means. That's not what the models tell us. What the models tell us is climate is a real problem, and climate will make the future progress that we're expecting, that we're seeing in all the scenarios, also from the UN Climate Panel, will be much better off, but will be slightly less much better off. Climate is not the end of the world. It means that our progress will happen slightly slower. We need to hear both things. Things have gotten much better, and they're likely to get much better. Climate is not the end all. And that means we can start being smart about our world. That means we can stop panicking and start saying, all right, what should we do with smart stuff? I'm pretty sure that there's going to be 1,500 people at ARC. There's a lot of different opinions about what's smart. I'm simply going to put in those 12 smart things in the hat of great things. And I think a lot of people can agree on this. So it's about saying there's some really smart things here. You can only hear that if you stop screaming, if you will. And I think ARC can both be the place where we stop screaming and we start asking for smart stuff. And I don't have all the answers for ARC, and I'm pretty sure we'll have lots of different answers for it, but actually having a place where we stop screaming, where we don't say, oh, the end is near and we got to go net zero and that's really the only thing that matters, and start saying, all right, there's a lot of other things that matter, especially for the world's poor. Here are some of the very most impressive and amazing solutions. Those are the best things first.
And I know you've been very hesitant to ever criticize people, which is a wonderful trait. Is there, you might not like this question, but you are interacting with, as we've already said, the World Bank, UN, these types. Is that the people screaming? Is that a reference to, do we need ARC because those other global organizations are captured? Why is this going to be different from those ones?
So I think a lot of the world conversation is captured by a few very, very big things. And climate, to my mind, is obviously the biggest thing where we kind of know we're wrong. Climate is a real problem. It's not the end of the world, fundamentally. And that's important because then you can start, seeing climate clearly as one of the many things that we should fix, and that we're right now fixing incredibly badly at really high cost while forgetting a lot of other things. And so a lot of the organizations in the world, for instance, the World Bank, have been semi-captured by this sort of sentiment, oh, we need to do a lot more green. But the World Bank is still full of people who actually want to make sure that kids don't die from easily curable infectious diseases. And I would imagine that a lot of them are fed up with this whole, but climate all the time. Again, this does not mean these people are bad people. It doesn't mean that they're not recognizing climate as a serious issue, but they're also recognizing that there are much more serious issues that we, for much less money, can fix much better first. And that's really the conversation that we need to have. And I think the ARC conference can be part of that conversation. It's about getting people to realize overall, the world is not doomed. The world has been getting better. It will get better. And that means we can stop screaming, start being smart. And if we can do that, we will still disagree about some of the smart things, but we'll in general agree that you have to put out a smart argument in order to be heard or in order to at least be considered. And that would be an incredible progress from today, where we sort of just go down the routes that are politically convenient and what most of us think right now. But this is not about what you think. It's about what we know.
Bjorn, you're such an optimist, which is so... I mean, or at least you give that impression. So you have your grace not to slag anyone off. You're actually doing things positively. You're like this book, like these other books. You're not a doomsdayer like the rest, and it's wonderful, because actually it seems like the space is mainly pessimist.
Yeah, it's unoccupied. So I just want to sort of clarify that. I think you don't gain much from criticizing other people. I think sometimes you need to point out that, we were clearly wrong back in the 70s when people thought we were going to run out of everything, this sort of limits to growth kind of argument. And that underpins a lot of the conversations that we have today. It was just wrong. And we need to point that out. But fundamentally, it's much, much more positive to tell people, here's what's right rather than what's wrong. I think that's just, it's a strategy thing. And I think it's much, much more effective to point out, here's what's right. Why don't we agree on that? Because that's a lot easier to get people to agree on. On the optimist bit, I really hope I'm not just being an optimist. I'm not trying to be an optimist. I'm trying to be a realist. I'm trying to say, what does the models actually tell us? So climate is not nothing. If I was an optimist, I'd probably say, we'll probably figure it out or something like that. That seems to be sort of the optimist kind of approach. I'm simply saying, well, look, you're being told in the media all the time that the end is nigh. But actually, if you read the UN Climate Panel report, please don't. It's very boring. And
I've read it.
Long.
I'm not going to ask you about because since we last spoke, the 6th edition has come out.
Yes, it has. Okay. But so you've experienced the boredom of IPC. But it's not because they're trying to be boring. It's just not all that exciting. But fundamentally, they tell us, here are problems. But if you try to make the estimate of how much of a problem, we're talking about 2, 3, 4% of GDP. It's a problem, not 100% of GDP. And that's incredibly important to make that point. That is not being optimist. That's being realist. Negativist? What's the opposite
pessimist.
Of an pessimist? Thank you. They would say, it's 100%. An optimist, I think, would say, it's pretty much zero. I'll round it down to zero. I think the right thing is to say it's 4% or 3%. But it's also important to say 3% is not what should be dominating the entire conversation. So again, this is simply about saying there are some really smart things we can do. And I hope that, your listeners and everybody will get a little more excited about some of the amazing things we can do on education, on health, on these very, very simple things.
On that positive note, Bjorn Lomborg, thank you again for speaking with me, coming in. And I recommend to listeners Best Things First, but also your other work, which I buy regularly for friends, because I think this is some of the most important books out in the moment, and your voice as a very moderate and optimistic one in particularly the climate field, but beyond as well is an extremely important one. So Bjorn, keep up the good work, and thank you so much for speaking with me. If you enjoyed this episode and this podcast series, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for listening.